Well, here we are, cats everywhere. It's overcast, obviously winter's approaching, fast approaching, and that's what you want. You don't want too much sun. Although, as I speak, the sun's trying to break through the clouds. Now today I want to look at the constitutional quagmire we find ourselves in. Now it's interesting that most Australians have no idea regarding the constitutional framework which governs the type of legislation which can be passed by Parliament at the state and federal level. Now in 1999, over a quarter century ago, delegates were elected from the various states to attend a constitutional convention in Canberra, which was to discuss the overturning of the monarchy and the introduction of a republic. Now there were three main arguments, and a fourth which I was involved in. Keep the monarchy, have an elected Governor-General, or have a Governor-General appointed by the Parliament of the day by a 2/3 majority. Now I stood on a different platform. I stood on a new constitution for a new millennium, a new constitution for a new 1,000 years. Because the current constitution, as you are well aware of, is basically a trade document which regulates the relationship between the various states. And over the past 126 years we've seen more and more power voluntarily given up by the states or achieved through a referendum which gives the central government more power and authority. But there are two main issues. There's issues at the federal level and there's issues at the state level regarding constitutional arrangements. Now this constitution we currently have, which people from the 6 states voted for in the 1890s, as I said before, is a trade document which regulates the relationship between the states and the central government. The dilemma is, as you're well aware of, there are no human rights in the Constitution, and there are no rights in terms of assuring Australians access to the Commonwealth. And that's why we continue to see a situation where the wealth of this country dissipates. And we continue to see that as far as our living standards is concerned, an increasing number of Australians find themselves in difficult situations. Many turning to divided nation as a solution to their problems. The fact is that our constitutional arrangements are the handbrake on change. I'll give you a simple example. State constitutions are determined by the government of the day. In Victoria, the Liberal National Opposition has a policy of tearing up a treaty which has been agreed to by various Indigenous groups in Victoria and the Victorian government. This is quite possible because the Victorian Constitution was not created by the Victorian people, doesn't require a referendum for major changes to occur. All it requires is a majority in both houses of Parliament. Obviously that's the limitation of a state-based constitution. Federally, it's a much more interesting situation. The founding fathers, and they were all fathers, no mothers involved, were interested in maintaining the status quo. They were interested in maintaining a community which showed allegiance to Great Britain, the major colonising force in this country. They were not interested in the concept of access to the Commonwealth by the people of this country. They were not interested in protecting the individual from the arbitrary exercise of state power. And in order for federation to occur, we saw a watering down of attempts to introduce human rights in the Australian Constitution. Now the problem becomes worse as time goes on, because the Australian Constitution is constructed in such a way that only a political party which has a majority in both houses of Parliament is able to put a question to the people. That means the way those questions are constructed and the reasons they're put to the people are basically about maintaining the status quo. Obviously there has been fundamental changes, like in 1949 where the federal government was given the power to create pensions for Australians, and in 1967 where the federal government was given the power to legislate for First Nations people. But the majority of questions put to the Australian people in referendums tend to fail, as we saw with the Voice to Parliament a few years ago. And they fail to a significant degree because you need a majority, not just in a majority of states, that's 4 out of 6 states, but also a majority in terms of the number of people. So when you have a constitution where only Parliament, only the party which is a majority in both houses of Parliament can actually write the call of referendum and actually determine the content, the words that will be used, that will be put to the people, and that you need such a significant majority, unless there is a groundswell of support from different political parties, the chances of any constitutional arrangement being passed are minimal. So we have a constitution in Australia, a federal constitution, which does not keep up with the times. So we see the High Court attempting to beat the Constitution into a document which determines the way we live. For example, it was a 4-3 majority in the High Court which recognised on the 3rd of June 1992 that First Nations people who had been here for 65 years had rights to land in law because of their prior occupation. For the previous 204 years of colonisation, before 1992, the doctrine of terra nullius, that's the land of no one, was the legal fiction on which this land was colonised. So we have this ridiculous situation where we have a fossilised constitution. Now interestingly, in 1999, when in Victoria, I attempted to become a delegate to Canberra on the policy of creating a new constitution which reflects the realities of everyday life. That was at the end of the 20th century, at the beginning of the 21st century. I was only able to achieve around 5,000 votes from 4 million votes which were cast in Victoria. So obviously, most people at that particular point in time seemed to be satisfied with a debate about whether we become a republic which is led by a president or governor general who's elected by the people or appointed by Parliament, or we have our supreme leader, the British royal, in inverted commas, family. So obviously we see increasing tensions emerging in our community, and we see increasing tensions emerging in our community as a direct consequence of the inability of parliamentarians to frame legislation to deal with the issues that face us. This is compounded by the fact that parliamentary legislation, to a significant degree, is determined by the interests of the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. That's why, in one of the richest countries, sovereign nation states on planet Earth, we have over 32 private charities raising money for different issues, because the government never has the funds to ensure that we all have the ability to enjoy the commonwealth created in this country. The problem has been compounded by the fact that the blood, sweat and tears of generations who, through their taxation revenue, were able to convince governments to set up public institutions to deal with essential services, to assist them in their day-to-day lives, have been privatised during the past 50 years. And what we've seen is the fact that public institutions, whether they were Telecom, Commonwealth Bank, Commonwealth Serum Laboratory, just to name a few, belong to the people. Because of our constitutional arrangements, they don't belong to the people, they belong to the government of the day. And at the state and federal level, we have seen governments privatise public assets, losing the ability to obtain revenue from these public assets, losing the ability to ensure that every person on this continent has access to the basic necessities of life. So we are faced with a significant dilemma. There is no way that a constitution which puts private interests before public interests will ever be able to solve the significant problems that are developing in this country. Now, a lot of people like to denigrate the increasing number of people who turn to divided nation as racists or rednecks. The reality is, most people in this country are decent. Most people in this country are looking for solutions which go beyond them just surviving. When you have 1/3 of the country dependent on social security benefits to survive, when you have 1/3 of the country having to find money for a mortgage, when you have 1/3 of the country having to rent because they'll never be able to buy property in the private sector, irrespective of the limited reforms which come through parliamentary legislation. When you have opposition parties, whether the Liberal National Party, which is all about maintaining the hegemony, the power of the private sector, especially the corporate-based private sector, and another significant party, Divided Nation, whose policies are designed to lay the blame for the situation we find ourselves in today directly on the shoulders of the other First Nations people, immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, transsexuals, and the list goes on and on. The fact is that without major constitutional changes, there will not be any significant improvement in the lives of people in this country, irrespective of the legislation, the watered down legislation which filters through Parliament. Having a trickle, not trickle down, but having a trickle down economy only helps the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. And that's why over the last half a century, through globalisation and corporatisation and deregulation and privatisation, we have seen their fortunes increase. And when we see the richest person on this continent donate significant resources and money to divided nation, you begin to understand that they have no solutions to the emerging issues apart from creating deeper and deeper and deeper divisions. So how do we go about ensuring constitutional change? The first step is to understand the situation we find ourselves in and understand the limitations of the constitutional framework. The next step is to create movements, whether through public interest before corporate interest, which puts the interests of the many before the interests of the few, or other significant organisations to demand constitutional change. Demand the ability of the Australian people to initiate constitutional change through citizens-initiated referendums. Demand that all public assets, the Australian people be given the opportunity to incorporate public assets into the Australian Constitution so they can't be sold at the ideological whim of the government of the day. Unless there is that demand, the tragic situation we find ourselves in 2026 will continue to deteriorate, will continue to have increasing poverty, will continue to have increasing dissension in the community, increasing violence. Ultimately, power does not lie in the hand of the state or the government of the day or religious institutions, but in the hands of the people. Not in the hands of a people who are nothing more than, bystanders, whether interested or disinterested, but in the hands of an engaged public. And unless as a people we become engaged, that we realise that politics is not just about casting a ballot every 3 to 4 years to elect representatives who basically are limited in what they can do by our current constitutional arrangements, but in the hands of an engaged public. An engaged public is a public that is willing to raise issues. Why do you think that during the Whitlam era, 4 years, 2 federal elections, they passed more than 258 significant reforms? Things like universal healthcare, Medibank it was called in those days, Medicare today, no-fault divorce, community health centres, community radio stations, and the list goes on, because of the push from below, because people demanded change, they demanded legislation, and that government put referendum after referendum after referendum to the Australian people, which failed on almost every occasion. So ultimately, we are guided by constitutional arrangements. Like people who have a religious belief are guided by the principles those beliefs are based on, by the books those beliefs are based on. We in this country are guided by our constitutional arrangements, and our constitutional arrangements ensure the status quo remains the same, irrespective of changing needs and changing circumstances. Things will only get worse in a country which should be leading the way as far as access to equality and power is concerned.